this is really how we think about inflation. Inflation is really a measure of how you are doing relative to the things that you like to consume. And as we change that consumption bundle, we get different measures of how well you're doing. So the way that we ultimately come up with the measure is to fix that basket of goods. Sometimes we use the approximation that given a generic basket of goods that we all sort of like to consume, we use that as our rate of inflation, and then we calculate the real rate as given the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. So most often for consumers, we use a consumer price index, CPI. For producers, we'll use a producer price index. And for the biomedical industry, we'll use something called BRDPI. BRDPI stands for the Biomedical R&D Price Index. It is constructed by NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and it really uses as a basket what NIH spends on its various different bundles of goods. And it was constructed because Congress really wanted to get a sense of what NIH was doing with its funds and whether or not the money that was going to NIH was enough to cover the various different expenses. So they wanted to measure how quickly those expenses were changing. So that's what BRDPI is. Just to give you a little bit of sense of numbers, so this is the CPI index basket composition. You can see that this big chunk, 42% of that is housing. And the way that they got these numbers is from actually looking at the composition of consumption goods in the United States. This is as of December 2016, and using those weights in order to construct the basket of goods to calculate inflation. So 42% is what the average person spends on housing, whether it's rent or mortgage. And this next big piece here, this 15%, is transportation. That's a big piece. This blue piece here is food and beverages. We've got to eat. But then the next biggest piece after that, this piece here, is medical expenses at 8.3%. So healthcare expenses are a pretty significant component of the CPI. And you can actually get a separate measure just of healthcare and see how that's been going. Obviously, that's been increasing at a pretty significant rate. And just to give you a sense now of the biomedical realm, this is the memo that establishes the need and the requirement to calculate BRDPI, this biomedical R&D index. And here's a picture of BRDPI relative to how GDP has grown in inflation. And you can see that the cost of biomedical expenses has been going up at a much faster rate. This is not CPI, this is the GDP. If I put CPI, it would be somewhere in between. But still, BRDPI has been increasing much faster than the rate of inflation. And one of the questions that I want to put to you is why? Why is that the case? Why are medical expenses, healthcare expenses, going up faster than the rate of inflation? It's actually related to the same question that was asked about tuition and educational expenses. So let me not take too much of the class time to go into that detail, but I want to give you at least a flavor of that after we just say one more thing about how you make use of inflation, which is that you want to use nominal discount rates to discount nominal cash flows and real discount rates to discount real cash flows. That's the only real lesson that you have to remember when you're using this from an NPV calculation perspective, okay? But from the healthcare perspective, there are other interesting discussions that I'll come to in just a minute. But for now, real versus real, nominal versus nominal, just be consistent and you won't make a mistake in dealing with inflation. Now, in certain contexts, that's easier said than done, depending on the nature of the application. You know, here in the United States, we don't have to worry that much about inflation. Inflation has been pretty low in our country for a long period of time. So let's take a look in the US. These are the inflation rates for the last 7 or 8 years. And you can see that actually inflation has gone down between 2009 and 2016. We're actually pretty low in the grand scheme of things. If you take a country like Argentina, on the other hand, this is really problematic. In the most recent year of 2016, Argentina had inflation of over 40%. I mean, that's a tremendous toll on consumers, and you really have to think carefully about how you invest your money. Somebody once told me that in a very high inflation country, he was reminded by his grandmother that he ought to take taxis everywhere instead of buses. And when he asked Grandma, why is that? She said, it's because with a taxi, you pay at the end of the ride. With the bus, you have to pay at the beginning of the ride. And so it's that much cheaper. Now, that sounds like a joke until you look at 40% inflation, and now it's not so funny anymore. It's actually pretty serious. That is a huge loss to you by holding assets that are denominated in nominal currencies.